and thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, although it is virtual. I'd love to be there in person. I'm sure we all would as well. But all right, well, let's dive into it because there's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers. So we're going to talk about kind of where we've been with design systems, the present state of design systems, and kind of what's coming next in the world of design systems. And to go into the past, we're going to go literally all the way back. We're going to go back into the very beginning of sort of human communication and how we started communicating with one another visually. So cave paintings have been around for about 45,000 years, going all the way back in sort of prehistory, and we've been communicating as a species with one another for about that long, and it seems to be going back in time. With each new year, there's earlier cave paintings discovered, but so we've been at this for a long time, and we've been introducing new visual ways and sort of new ways of communicating as humans, and evolving how that communication has happened. So what I'm going to do is just sort of step through some of those ways that we've been communicating with each other. So ancient Egypt introduced the concept of branding all about sort of about like 7,000 years ago. And we've been sort of building upon sort of our visual mode of communication as a species for a long time. Logos have been in use for a long time. The beer brand Stella Artois is the oldest logo that's actually still in use today, dating all the way back to 1366. But different technologies and tools have emerged over history in order to help us and assist us in the way that we communicate as a species. Gutenberg's printing press, for instance, revolutionized how we communicate in the written word and introduced all sorts of new vehicles for communication. We have the Industrial Revolution that happened, which sort of introduced the modern notion of the corporation or company, but also sort of really revolutionized and introduced a lot of new vehicles and technologies for how humans sort of communicate with one another, but also just how small the world is. Sort of introducing the introduction of radio and TV from the 1920s to the 1950s introduced new modes of communication, not just sort of spoken word and the written language anymore, but also sort of new modalities for us to communicate in. And really in the 1960s and 1970s is where the sort of modern sort of marketing and sort of corporate identity sort of concept kind of came into being, right? So we have this sort of notion of sort of the modern sort of branding landscape and marketing landscape and corporate communication landscape with logos like the Great Saul Bass and things. It was really in this era, in the sort of 60s and 70s, that we started to see the first real efforts to kind of take all of these disparate modes of communication and to actually start to systematize those and to start to make sense of them. So we had these brand books that sort of started to emerge for how an organization might communicate across all of these different sort of channels and platforms. So we have something like the NASA guidelines from Danny and Blackburn that sort of spelled out, how the NASA logo would work across different sort of platforms and on different backgrounds and with different sort of subtitles attached to it and things like that, what signage systems looked like. And this is really important because, as it happens, right, the NASA logo was plastered on everything, including objects that are still floating around in space today. So it's actually very important to get that logo right, for instance. And so we still have this concept of brand books and things like that in this day and age. Obviously, as technology evolved, it went from being a physical book into sort of PDFs. And now, of course, we have sort of things like websites that sort of house this kind of information. Things like this is West Virginia University, an American university that sort of shows their brand guidelines for how to use their logo, how not to use their logo, what sort of typography to reach for, what their color palettes are, and sort of how to think about and use those assets in different communication channels. So that kind of helped. That was the first real sort of effort to really sort of systematize and sort of make sense of how an organization communicates across different platforms. In the 70s, we sort of saw the introduction of graphical user interfaces, right? By companies like Xerox and early Apple computers really revolutionized and introduced this concept of interacting with a UI. And then, of course, that got a big shot in the arm with the introduction of the World Wide Web in 1989 by this guy, Tim Berners-Lee, who introduced this notion of network computers and sort of showing, sort of a very accessible way to sort of communicate and sort of broadcast documents to one another. This isn't a comprehensive history, but it's worth stating that the introduction of CSS sort of helped unleash new capabilities for this brand new medium that is the web. If anybody remembers GeoCities and AngelFire and sort of all of those sites back in the day, we sort of start seeing the web really come into its own as its own medium, its own distinct medium, and also really unlocking new capabilities for this new platform. So this is the very, very first launch of Amazon.com. This is the first Amazon web design, which is utterly gorgeous. But as sort of CSS sort of hit the scene, we unlocked new capabilities and the platform got even stronger and more capable. Tools like MySpace gave us the ability to sort of create our own profiles, but also customize the style and the look and feel of those profiles, if anybody did that back in the day. So we see this continuing to emerge and evolve with the rise of mobile. The modern sort of smartphone, right, was introduced in 2007 with the App Store, the native App Store, introduced a year later in 2008. And then Android's kind of hot on the tails, what was called Android Marketplace, which rebranded to the Google Play Store. But that sort of introduced yet more sort of vehicles for communication and interaction, right? So we now have, the print, we have radio, we have TV, we have outdoor broadcasting, we have the size of airplanes and spacecrafts, but we also have native iOS apps and Android apps and websites and everything under the sun. And sort of in 2010, really, the introduction of responsive web design hit the scene by Ethan Marcotte, which really introduced a way for web developers and designers to really start to address this notion, this increasing sort of multitude of connected devices that can all access the web. So rather than having to create sort of separate web experiences in order to reach iPhones and Android phones and iPads and things like that, we could instead create one flexible website that can sort of reach all of these different users. So what we're seeing with the introduction of responsive web design is really kind of hitting on something that I hope that whole timeline helps sort of encapsulate, is this notion of kind of more. As humans have evolved, as our communication channels, as our technology has continued to advance and grow, we're adding more and more things to our pile all the time, which is great because it introduces new exciting opportunities to communicate, collaborate, and really innovate with one another. But it also adds a lot to our own worlds, right? So this notion as web practitioners, we are on the hook to deliver, more products, more services, more functionality, more features, more content, and deliver those to sort of more people, more users, and more countries speaking more languages with more sort of contexts and browsers and devices and environments and screen factors and just all these different modalities and considerations. This is exhausting. This is what we're up against, right? Every day. And unfortunately, even though our technology continues to seemingly expand at an exponential rate, our timelines and our budget and our resources don't also expand exponentially. So how do we address this notion of more? These are just, this is from a client of mine, a publishing client I worked with a number of years back, but this really encapsulates, I think, the problem at hand, which is this company, this publisher had several dozen brands, and they had several dozen websites to serve those different brands. And each one of these buttons was found on one of their brand websites. And you could see that each one of these things is kind of the same, but also kind of different, right? But each one of these buttons represents a team's design time, development time, QA time, testing time, and also, of course, the maintenance time and effort and cost that associates with this. So this is not the way to go. This is not how we address our present landscape, right? And it's also sort of a fool's errand to continue to try to, kind of create multiple versions of the same experience and create multiple comps and multiple sort of, this is just a waste of talented team members' time and effort. So we literally have to blow up this idea of sort of creating these whole web pages and thinking about how those work across these sort of different screen sizes. But we also quite literally need to blow up our user interfaces into smaller problems. And that's what sort of enters the world of design systems. So design systems are, it's a very nebulous sort of concept, and it's kind of an unfortunate term just because it has the word design in it. And it's really not just a thing that pertains to designers. I tend to define a design system as the official story of how an organization designs and builds digital products. There are a lot of ingredients that go into helping tell that story. And there's a lot of things that can be included. Some things are required, some things aren't. Broadly speaking, though, these sort of different ingredients can be sort of split out into sort of three buckets, which is to say, a design kit, like a UI kit in the form of a Figma library or a Sketch library or something like that. And then a code corollary of all of those things that contain low-level reusable UI components, things like buttons and accordions and tabs and form controls and things like that, as well as sort of all of these sort of foundational systems that kind of underpin those component libraries. Things like color systems and typography systems and grid systems and so on. And then the sort of third pillar of the sort of tangible bits of a design system effort is the kind of instruction manual in the form of documentation and a reference website, right? So here's our button component and here's how to use that, right? Here's our accordion component and here's some considerations and some usage guidelines, as well as sort of things like API documentation, UX guidelines, and things like that, right? So at this stage in the game, the concept of design systems is really nothing new. They've been around for the better part of a decade, and we have very famous and visible examples of design systems out in the wild, things like Material Design by Google, of course. We have Salesforce's Lightning Design System, Shopify's Polaris system, including a few that I've had the pleasure of working on, Atmos for United Airlines, Helix for Pfizer, and many, many other ones. In fact, on our website, styleguides.io, you can kind of peruse different public-facing design systems for inspiration and for theft. So you could sort of steal what other design systems are doing. So design systems are here to help us with this problem of more, right? We are tasked with creating more things for more people and all of these different sort of use cases. How do we do that smartly? So design systems are here to help, and they provide many, many different benefits for us as we sort of tackle this multi-device digital landscape. The number one benefit that design systems provide is a more consistent and cohesive product experience. And what I mean by that is people are able to sort of traverse across, one web product, or maybe different web products, or maybe different digital project or products in general. So it's sort of skipping between the iOS app and a website and so on and so forth, and be able to sort of get the same general experience across the board. Jacob Nielsen, the usability expert, talks about consistency as being one of the most powerful usability principles. When things always behave the same, users don't have to worry about what will happen, right? Instead, they will know what will happen based on earlier experience. So the first time you're confronted with a date picker, you have to learn those conventions. You have to learn those controls. You have to learn how to interact with that thing. But the spirit of design systems is that the second and third and fourth time you need to interact with the date picker across your product ecosystem, that will, because you've already encountered it and because it's consistently used from the design system, users will internalize how that date picker works and will sort of, have a more enjoyable and consistent experience. So that's the overwhelming, sort of end user experience of having a design system. But most of the benefits are that design systems provide are for people like us, right? So the actual practitioners and the teams that are actually creating these digital products. So the number one and probably most visible and obvious benefit that design systems give teams is the ability to get things done faster, right? By not having to reinvent the wheel over and over and over again, by not having to rebuild that button component or that card component for the 16th time, teams are able to sort of get things out the door faster. On our podcast, we interviewed Frederico Holgado from MailChimp, and he talked about this page, which is the status page for MailChimp, which is just, are MailChimp's services up and running, yes or no? And he said that this page is not a page that is a big priority. He says, we call them the dark corners. He said, but by having a design system, we copied and pasted a pattern, we changed a few things, and in 20 minutes, we built a page that was responsive, it looked great on mobile, and was nice to look at. By having a pattern you could use that's already 95% of the way there, it brings up the quality of everything so those dark corners aren't so dark anymore. I love that visual, so I really love including that. And what he's speaking to is not just the speed, which he said, in 20 minutes we could bang out a page really quick, which is great. But what he's also speaking to is this sort of increased quality. So not only is it you're rolling things out faster than ever and being able to iterate faster, but we're also able to sort of launch higher quality products because we're not reinventing the wheel again and again and again. Micah Godbolt, who works at Microsoft, says, once we get past the tedium of building the same thing over and over again, we can focus our energy on more worthwhile tasks like accessibility, performance, and iteration. We can work on the fun stuff rather than the tedious things. And to just give an example of that, hopefully most of us know sort of HTML 101, right? In order to create an accessible form experience, we need to create a relationship between a label sort of HTML tag and the input tag, right? And the way that we do that is by sort of adding a for attribute to our label that maps that label to the corresponding input. Without this, you don't have an accessible experience, right? That label is just kind of floating around. It's not connected to that input. So that's kind of HTML 101, but it requires sort of maintaining that relationship between that input and that label. Things get more complicated whenever we start adding things like helper text into the mix. And so if we have a password field, again, we need to kind of create that relationship between the label and the input. But then we might have a sort of helper text that's at present, what we're looking at here isn't connected to the actual sort of input. And so what that translates to is an experience that looks fine, but for a user that's interacting with this web experience using a screen reader, what we have is an inaccessible experience. And let me sort of read out what that sounds like for someone browsing this experience using VoiceOver.
Choose a password, secure, edit text. You are currently on a text field inside of web content. To enter text in this field, type.
Notice anything? That nowhere was that sort of password requirement helper text sort of mentioned. So how do we fix that? Well, the way we fix that is by using a tag called, or an attribute called aria described by, and then we add an ID to our paragraph that basically sort of creates a relationship between the input and that helper text. So now once that is in place, here's what that sounds like to a screen reader.
Choose a password, secure, edit text. Your password must be at least 8 characters long. You are currently on a text field inside of web content. To enter text in this field, type.
There we go, right? So now screen reader users who already have a much tougher go on the web, if we're honest, have a better experience, right? Rather than sort of, pecking out a password only to find that it doesn't meet the requirements. We've all done that before, and we get frustrated by it, right? So the more we can kind of create these better, more accessible experiences, the better off we'll all be. But the problem with this is now we're maintaining multiple sets of relationships. And this is not terribly difficult, but whenever push comes to shove, whenever you multiply the number of form fields that we sort of create and launch out into the world, these are the kinds of things that tend to slip between the cracks. So this is where a design systems component library can really sort of step in and sort of save the day. So what can happen is we can actually sort of take that on as a design system team and actually build a text field component that actually takes these relationships into account and actually sort of takes care of them for us. So this is a little bit of React code. Don't really focus on the sort of specifics of it. This could be done in any framework or library. It doesn't really matter. It's not specific to React. But the spirit is that we can kind of create a text field component that takes care of those relationships for us. And by surfacing props that basically have the sort of ID and the aria described by and the instructions on there, we can kind of take care of that stuff, that markup and those relationships behind the scenes. But what's even cooler is that we're able to sort of take our text field, and even if a user developer omits those aria described by and those ID props from the component, what can happen behind the scenes is that the component can be smart enough to actually generate those relationships, generate those IDs behind the scenes, even if the user developer doesn't pass that stuff in. So by default, that component will always have a relationship between the label and the input and the helper text, which is super, super cool and leads to a better experience and more accessible experience for everyone. So this is what we're talking about by sort of baking in accessibility best practices, front-end best practices, design best practices, UX best practices. We're able to bake all of these into a reusable set of components, which is really, really powerful. By way of doing that, we're able to sort of isolate our components and make them easier to test, where we're able to sort of write unit tests for these things. We're able to use things like Storybook to sort of like test different sort of states and sort of showcase those different states, which is all great. They're also tremendously powerful for building bridges between designers and developers, as well as different teams across an organization, right? So everyone is sort of speaking the same language when it comes to the UI. And it's also a useful reference to keep referring back to as you're sort of doing your ongoing product work. So again, things like Storybook are really great at sort of automatically and automagically sort of generating sort of prop documentation for things like, here's our button component and here's what props are available for any sort of given component, right? So this is like really, really helpful and important work to sort of refer to as you're just sort of doing, sort of reaching for these components to create new sort of products. And then the last benefit that design systems provide is really the ability to kind of modify and extend and improve over time, right? Even if you were to do big re-architectures or big sort of redesigns or rebrands and things like that, once you have a system in place, you're able to sort of build upon it or sort of move sort of sideways. But that work becomes a lot more achievable. And you don't have to sort of throw a design system away, because at the end of the day, your user interfaces are still going to have buttons, you're still going to have cards, you're still going to have typography, you're still going to have all of this stuff. So it's really, really important to sort of think of a design system as a foundation that can be built upon and grown over time and matured over time. So that's kind of the current state of affairs. And, again, this sort of notion of design systems has been around for the last, sort of decade or so, thanks to a lot of pioneering women like Natalie Down, Anna Debenham, Gina Ann, who have all been sort of talking about design systems since even before the term design systems was really around. So that's a little bit of kind of where we're at and what design systems are. What's the sort of present state of design systems? Right now, we're kind of looking at sort of parallel implementations between design tools and code. So we have something like Carbon's design system by IBM, and they have a sketch library that contains all of their different components. And then they have different sort of tech implementations of their component library in different sort of JavaScript frameworks and stuff like that. But so they have their own sort of code corollary to this. And then that all gets sort of wrapped up in a sort of reference website. Now, we all know this, that whenever there's sort of like a gap in between sort of comps and in code, we end up with this kind of situation, which is like very often design teams are sort of given a long runway to sort of iterate over designs, and they're sort of sweating all the sort of pixels and making them all perfect. And then sort of developers are sort of given the short end of the stick oftentimes. And we sort of have much less time to sort of implement this stuff. And in the process of kind of translating a comp into code, a lot of things, a lot of nuance and that pixel perfection tends to, sort of slip between the cracks, we'll say. But that's the sort of current state of affairs. So we still have this kind of disconnect between the design and development worlds. And also products and people and processes are still very much in transition. Even Google, who has maybe one of the most mature and well-adopted design systems in the world, they still have many different products out there that are not using material design. And also our processes are still sort of mapped. That disconnect between design and development still sort of has that kind of developer handoff mode where it's like designers and developers are still kind of operating in different worlds. So what happens next, right? What's the future of design systems? I think that I don't know this for certain, but these are a few things that I'm particularly excited about. One is there's a lot of work that's happening right now to really close the gap between designers and developers. So there's different tools that are out there, like things like React, Sketch, that backfills the React library into Sketch. We have things like the Figma API that's able to sort of output design values to make those available to code and plugins and other things. We have sort of tools like Framer and UX Pin. And we even have whole things like whole startups like Modules that are really trying to sort of like merge these worlds of code and design and to really treat code as the source of truth for a design system that designers could then interact with in a different way. So that's exciting. And that work is happening right now. It's not really something that I think that we could rely exclusively on tools with, but it's really more a cultural and a process kind of mentality of really sort of adopting a more communicative and collaborative workflow between designers and developers. So tools can help, but it's not solely about that sort of tool problem. It's more of a people problem. I also think that there's going to be better orchestration around technologies and across technologies. Design tokens are one vehicle that are sort of currently being used right now to kind of treat low-level design decisions as these sort of reusable tokens that could then sort of cascade out into different tech platforms and sort of tech stacks. So what we're talking about with design tokens are these sort of like low-level values, things like Starbucks green or Coca-Cola red, or sort of different sort of type, font families and other sort of low-level design values. And then tools like Theo or Style Dictionary can be used to kind of convert these values into something like Sass variables or a JSON file or CSS custom properties or iOS or Android sort of specific environments. This is really powerful because this gives us the ability to sort of manage these things in one place and then sort of make changes to those and then sort of cascade them out to different tech platforms. I also think that there's some really exciting opportunities here to sort of better serve different tech stacks. One thing right now, as sort of presently the case, there's often different products at an organization that are built in Angular and different products that are built in React and different products that are built in Vue or whatever that might be, other things like a Drupal site or a WordPress site or just whatever, it doesn't really matter. We have a multitude of different sort of tech stacks floating around any given organization's infrastructure. And to create a design system that can serve those different things, the kind of present state is a little bit, requires some duplication of effort, right? We have to create a React library and an Angular component library and a Vue library. And those things can share things together, but it's still a little bit of a manual effort. One thing that we've been really excited about, what we've been working with for the last couple of years, is actually building our design systems using web components. And what that allows us to do is sort of take care of, rather than it being kind of a manual effort to sort of duplicate these things, what we're able to do is actually sort of build our web components and build our UI components like buttons and accordions and tabs and form controls as these native web components, and then sort of feed those into their respective sort of tech implementations. So that might look something like this. So we have a button and you can sort of have like text and variant and sort of size and all that good stuff. But then what you're able to do once you have your sort of styles and your sort of markup and stuff baked into that component, you could then take your sort of big honkin' React component, something like this, that's like using maybe, a CSS and JS solution and stuff like that. You're writing as sort of JSX in order to write that markup. What you can do is kind of rip all of that stuff out and instead map your React props to the web component. And what this means is that you kind of get the best of both worlds. You have a React library that's using web components under the hood, but you're also able to have a React library that's able to plug into all the good stuff that things like React or Vue or Angular can do, things like state management and all that sort of good application specific stuff. And then the last thing that I predict is that increasingly we're still in this sort of period of transition, but I think that we're sort of turning a corner here where right now we tend to think of, well, we design and develop digital products, right? And sort of any docs that sort of happen are sort of a little bit off to the side. They're not necessarily sort of like built into our workflows. And what we need to do is sort of fix that, because we all know what happens to docs. They get abandoned and they become stale. And as soon as they stop sort of fitting the reality of the product, it's moot. So what we need to do is really sort of think of ourselves as people who are creating design systems that in turn power products, first and foremost. And it's really a mental shift of thinking, rather than, oh, I'm building this product, I'm building a system that in turn builds products. So we've come a long way from branding cattle and all of the sort of, different ways that we've communicated as human beings. But one constant is true, which is to say that probably things aren't slowing down anytime soon, right? We're going to continue to have more screens, more frameworks, more sort of, modalities, more technology is coming down the pipes, right? I love this quote from Benjamin Franklin. He says that when you're finished changing, you're finished. And this is hard work, right? This constantly, forces us to challenge our assumptions, our best practices, our current workflows and ways of doing things. This is hard. This is hard to do and to constantly continue to evolve. And for what it's worth, though, for as hard as it is, it's also a heck of a lot of fun. I don't know if you all played with Lego bricks growing up, but it's kind of like what we do now with design systems. And I think that that's really, really amazing. So with that, everybody, thank you so much for your time and listening to me.